All right, so I have everything hooked up here. Um, what I'm doing differently um, from the test I conducted yesterday. Yesterday, I used this battery right here, which I realized that battery was not powerful enough. Um, and through testing, even with that battery, I came to the conclusion that the starter is pulling a tremendous amount of current. While it's a smaller engine, at the same time, the compression ratio is very high. And so the starter has to overcome that high compression ratio. And that's the reason why they have this valve thing right here so that you can bleed off some of that compression when you're manually starting it with the hand crank. So today I got this 4 AWG wire, um, black and red, and I of course got some properly sized ring terminals, and I have everything connected with the 4 AWG wire, and the battery right here, as you could see, I have it at 12 point. It's measuring 12.4 volts at the panel, and it's probably around 12.6 at the battery itself. Using that meter right here. So we have this set to start. Put some throttle in there and set this down. And we're gonna give it a try. Okay, so obviously you can see that it did start. The display did not reset at all. It kept it running perfectly with no problems. So the I believe the first attempts that we made, um, this battery was actually also used. So the battery is not the problem, but the gauge of this wire right here is what made the difference. We have at least three things in this harness setup that's not ideal. The first one was the battery connection. It was not ideal. I believe we were using some kind of lower gauge wire, and I'm not sure if the ring terminals were, properly done, because these connections have to be tight, and because sometimes when you start, if the connections are not tight, you just get like a spark and it breaks connection. And if you don't have the thick enough gauge wire, also you get that massive voltage drop. Um, so I fixed the connections, and then the next thing that was wrong here is the pulling power directly from the starter pulse, because as you can see, when the starter starts to pull all that current, it's gonna be on this wire, these two wires right here, and you are pretty much pulling voltage from where you're gonna have the worst voltage drop in this entire current loop. right? So that's the next thing that's wrong, or not necessarily wrong, but not ideal, right? The other situation that's not ideal is that we are pulling power for the starter solenoid signal from the same line that the display is getting power from, and we're splicing that in right here, um, right? So when you send that current to energize this starter solenoid right here, that current is traveling from here, right, going all the way up to the panel, to the back of the display, and then through these relays it sends the current back down, and then it hits the solenoid. So there goes another voltage drop that you're introducing by having a current that's flowing in the same path as the power for the display, right? So that's three things. First, the gauge of this wire for starting. Second, the starter pulse, pulling power from the starter pulse, not ideal. The third, having the current loop for the starter solenoid and the ECU solenoid on the same line as the display. And I improved one of the three, and it actually allows the engine to start. Now, yesterday, right, I put a jumper cable from my wife's car onto here and tried to start, and it still was resetting, right? So it was resetting with a jumper cable from my wife's car. And what I then did was I manually used a shortened wire to put the power from here to here, which means that even with the display in a reset mode, the power is still applied to the starter. And that would simply be a test to see if the overall system would start even if the panel did not reset. And sure enough, when I did that, it cranked for a lot longer, right? But eventually it just stalled. And because the reason for that is the jumper cable that I was using was some kind of cheaper jumper cable, and I think it was somewhere about, that almost looks like 8-gauge wire, but it was very long because the car was parked like down here, and I had the wire running coming up and going around and then to here. So even then I could tell that I needed to have heavier gauge wire in order for the starter to get the current that it needs. Now, so with that, I simply, improved that. And of course, I'm pretty sure the battery in my wife's car is much bigger than this. And it's also a newer battery. So it has more current, but the gauge of the wire was not sufficient. And therefore, we were still not able to start, even with bypassing the display. And of course, the display was totally shutting down anyway. So it was not holding the power to keep the starter turning. So my recommendation is to specify in the documents that we need to use for this specific engine. And I'm pretty sure that maybe even Yanmar would have put some kind of recommendation for, typically for these cables you are using some kind of, 0 gauge or something really heavy. But I think in this case, with the length, 4 gauge is sufficient for this type of length right here. If you're going to have the battery even further away, then you're probably going to need more. And we have to also remember that even though it's starting right now, we're starting because the battery is like topped up. So whenever you get to a situation where the battery is like still has enough power in there to start the engine, right? But it's just that due to the unrealistic connections like pulling power from here, you are going to start to get resetting events. Even when there's enough power in there to keep that starter motor turning. So we have to do something to improve the odds that you are going to be able to start even with a battery it has just enough power in there to start, right? And so with that said, of course you want to keep this heavy gauge wire. We could move this power for the panel from the starter post and put it directly to the battery. We could do that. That would even make it better, right? That would make it that even with the battery even a little bit lower, you're still able to start without getting a reset, right? And then the next thing that we could do is we could change the gauge of this wire, because remember, we are pulling the power to energize this pull solenoid right here from this same line, and we're creating that current loop that the display is also in that current loop, which is going to allow it to see a voltage drop. Sorry for the video being this long, but you know, if we then make this wire 10 gauge wire, right, then what that's going to do is 10 gauge is going to be all the way on this run, splice back to 12 here, because we have to do 12 to go through the back of the connector here, the terminal I should say. And what's going to happen is with this 12 gauge wire, with this 10 gauge wire for this run, which looks like about 8 feet, you are going to have less voltage drop again. Just like I did with the heavier gauge right here, took away the voltage drop completely. That was preventing a fully charged battery from not being able to start. Likewise, when this battery starts to go low, you're going to find that pulling this wire down here is going to allow you to start. And likewise, changing this wire to a 10 gauge is also going to allow you to start by keeping the display powered up while the starter is pulling all the current that it needs. So, you know, we can do, I've done 2 more things that we can do, and you know, it's only going to make the system more reliable and make it also start during events where the battery is either not so strong, or even a cold start event where, you know, outside is really cold, and of course because of that the battery itself is not so strong, and you're going to require longer, you know, turning to get the your first fire from an engine that's just sitting there cold. So once again, it works the way it is, just based on improving the wire gauge for the cables back here. And the proof is the engine is trying to run away from me. Yeah. Sorry for this long video. The end.